All right, let's go get started. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the talk on building client-side apps and components for Orchard. When we formed our company in 2013, we were so happy when we came up with this name. Sipke and I, we was beside a pool somewhere in sunny Tuscany, if I recall, and we thought we'd come up with such a clever name. And Mike asked me yesterday what it alluded to, and I was so happy you asked, Mike, because this is what we envisioned when we came up with the name, and this is how we prefer for it to be sort of capitalized. And this is what everyone else thinks the name is. And this is how everyone else capitalizes it, except for Microsoft Word, which thinks it's this.
Right.
So you have to go back and change it every time you type it.
Every time.
Because we are such a geographically distributed little community, I don't know if it's just me, but whenever I'm on one of the weekly calls or a one-on-one with one of you guys, I always think to myself, I wonder what it looks like where this guy is right now. Like, is he at a desk somewhere? Is he with a laptop in a park? Is he, naked on his living room couch? And so I just wanted to give you a little glimpse into like what my everyday reality looks like. This is the desk in my home. I combined sort of office and living room where I'm at when I'm in the weekly community meetings most often. So that's where you can sort of picture me being in that office chair there. This is the look through that window that you can see to the left there. This is my apartment building is sort of next to a park. It's kind of like having a flat next to Central Park, but then again, not really. And the following picture is what Gothenburg, Sweden looked like on the morning that I left for New York. As you can see, not a very uplifting place to be. Who here has seen the movie 50 Shades of Grey? Okay, only you, Sipke. I haven't seen it. I hear it's very exciting. Let me tell you, Gothenburg, Sweden is not that exciting. It is more like 50 Shades of Grey in the literal monochromatic sense. And actually, the new one, 50 Shades Darker, is pretty appropriate as well.
That's the picture where you are naked, actually.
I thought that was only you. All right, enough goofing. So this talk is going to be about, for the past couple of years or so, I've worked on a couple of projects where there's been a desire to use Orchard as a CMS, but also a requirement to provide some very modern, kind of very dynamic and interactive modern web user experiences, with a special emphasis on the kinds of UX where you can do a lot of interactions without necessarily having to go and reload the whole page. And in working on those projects, I've sort of had to come up with a few techniques and tips and tricks on how you can blend those two seemingly incompatible concepts of a, completely front-end client-side dynamic interactive components with the more traditional server-side CMS that is Orchard. And today I wanted to share with you some of the things that have worked well for me. And your mileage may vary, of course. There's a multitude of ways of doing things, and in all likelihood, there's even much better techniques than what I'm about to show you, but hopefully there's something in here that at least for everyone that you'll find useful as you go off and try and build Orchard sites in the future. So here's what I'm going to talk about. We first try and define the concept of a client-side component as it applies in this talk, and then we'll see how we can, in what shapes and forms we can package up these client-side components for use in Orchard. And then we'll look at the flip side of that, which is if you build a client-side component, something that just executes and runs its whole life cycle in the browser on the user's device, you'd probably want to integrate some Orchard stuff into it. So you want to be able to access, you want to be able to configure it from Orchard, you want to be able to have it to use it as content in your Orchard site possibly. So place it in zones like a widget or in a layout as an element. And you possibly want to be able to read site settings and stuff like that. So we'll look at some techniques for doing that in a way where you can use that stuff in the browser client side at runtime. And then we'll look into some tips for managing the actual code of client-side components. So that would be your scripts and styles, and do that effectively in an Orchard context. And then take a special look at some of the unique challenges that come with trying to integrate Angular 2 in an Orchard context. Specifically around routing, which is something that's a little bit tricky. And then if we have time, look at a little technique that you can use to do runtime module loading with Orchard. And then also possibly, if we have time at the end, some sort of design do's and don'ts that I like to keep in my mental model as I go and build these things. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so first off, how do I define a client-side component in this context? So the text is a bit small, I know. But I think of it as a reusable component that is stored and hosted in Orchard such that we can use it in an Orchard site as content. We can make it available to site owners and content editors to kind of go and place anywhere they want in their site. For example, as a widget or a layout element, but which renders and executes completely in the browser using JavaScript and communicates back to backend services using AJAX directly from the browser, so without going through Orchard for that stuff. And to illustrate this with a bit of diagrams to kind of contrast this with the way that we would traditionally build components for an Orchard site. So usually the way that you would think of a widget architecture, a request comes in to the Orchard site. This is Orchard up here, the browser down here. Request comes in at some point. A driver of a part gets invoked. That driver might do whatever interesting stuff your component does functionally and logically. Goes out perhaps to call to an external API to fetch some data, gets that back, processes it and massages it in any number of ways. That driver emits a shape. That shape gets rendered into a view, and that view outputs some markup that gets sent to the browser, and then we have it all pre-rendered, the content of the component, the result of it. And then if that component might be interactive in some way, so you might have a button somewhere in it where you click, and that button would typically go, and post back. So another Orchard request, and everything would sort of happen again, and it would process the input from the component, would render a different version of itself, and then on we go. And how I think of this working in a client-side component is more, also I was mention the key thing here is everything that our component does really happens on the server side. So including loading all that backend data, all the functionality, the interactivity, and the rendering into a markup that the browser could show. But in a client-side component, as I think of them, the architecture might work differently. So as far as Orchard is concerned, in the context of our Orchard site, we might actually only have a view representing the component. And I'll show you a technique in just a few seconds where you can basically literally just have a view in a module or a theme, and that view can become a component that you can place in layouts or widgets however you see fit. And that's really all we need really on the server side. And it renders something. What it renders is some piece of markup that includes its own JavaScript code to do all of the stuff that the component does functionally. So it might include a bunch of JavaScript here. It might include a template of some sort. It might go out to an external templating engine like Marco or Handlebars or any one of them to render that some data that it gets from the API and into some markup that it injects into a DOM element on the page. And then as you click the button to make something interactive happen, instead of just going back to the server, it can be handled by some event in that JavaScript code that can again call out to the API, maybe fetch some updated data, render that through the template, and sort of inject it into the DOM. And key thing there then being that all of the stuff that before used to happen on the server now happens on the client instead. Okay, so that's what I think a client-side component is and how it works in this context. So let's look at when this might be a good choice for a component on a site. I think of this as it's definitely not black and white. It's sort of more like the more of these questions that you answer with a yes, the more likely it is that this kind of architecture for a component might be a good choice for you. First one obviously being you want to provide that sort of modern user experience where you can do things with the component without it going back and reloading the page. And that's, I think that's really the key driver here. Another one is if your component's content is very personalized or very volatile, as we kind of touched upon yesterday in our donuts talk, then this might also be a good idea, because if you look at what happens, if your component is very personalized or very volatile, chances are you won't be able to output cache it for very long. And that means if the component's markup is rendered as part on the server side as part of everything else on the page, then if you can't output cache that, then you can't really output cache anything else either. Unless, of course, you use ideliverable.donuts. But that's sort of the subject of a different talk. And then in case you do, then this particular thing might not factor in. Another one is if your component uses one or more back-end REST APIs. And those APIs might reside on a completely different server somewhere, or they might be hosted in Orchard as an API in the existing site. But if your driver fetches data from something else, like a SQL database externally or something that is hard to call from the browser, then this might not be a good choice. But if it's a REST API, then that is really easy to call from code in JavaScript running in the browser. So if that's kind of your source of data, then this might also be an indicator that this is a good choice for you. And not unimportantly, if you have people on the team who are proficient in these front-end client-side frameworks, tools, and languages, then that might very well factor in too. Versus if you don't have anyone who knows this stuff, then you might not want to go down this route. Another thing is if your component takes a long time to load. So, like in this example here, if the driver calls out to an external API and that thing takes, let's say, 5 seconds to return, then why would you want to delay everything else that happens on this page and just make the user wait for the whole response just because that one thing takes a long time to process? So if you build this as a client-side component, really all that happens asynchronously, so the rest of your page can still be very snappy and responsive and visible to the user from the get-go. And then you could show something like a spinner in this component while it goes out and fetches its data from the API, which takes 5 seconds to complete, and waiting for it to get back and so forth, while the rest of the page is there and fine. And another point I want to touch on is an interesting point about scalability. Because when you think about it, any work that you do on the client device is sort of infinitely scalable, because every new user that hits your site brings with him one more CPU. So for whatever work you're doing on the client side, you really don't have to sort of worry about the scalability of that work. That's not to say that it's the most performant way to do that work, because the client devices for everyone might not be as fast as how you can theoretically do something on the server, but certainly from a scalability perspective alone, this might be something to think about. Okay, so I mentioned we're going to talk about a few different ways that you can formats that you can package a client-side component up in and make it available as content for use in an Orchard site. I think insofar as Orchard 1, and I should mention, by the way, all of the things I'm going to show are kind of within the context of Orchard 1.x. I'm guessing, no, I haven't had time to get so much into Orchard Core yet, but I'm guessing many of the concepts will apply equally in Orchard Core, but some of the techniques I'm going to show to do certain things are Orchard 1.x specific. So for Orchard 1.x, there's really a few different ways to package a component up, ranging from the absolute simplest thing, which is just basically to have a shape template, and then you can use something like a shape element to just arbitrarily create a shape with just a name on the fly, and then that'll just render that view, that shape template that you might have in your theme and your module. That's very simple. Ranging to like the most complex and functionally rich, which is to create a custom layout element or a custom part or field, where you can do a lot more things. You can provide, an infinitely advanced dynamic configuration UI, and everything is, you have full control, but you also have to go and write a lot more server-side code to make that component happen. There's more ceremony to it. So the part, you have to have the part itself, a handler to activate it, a driver, the view, the settings part, the settings view to configure it, and so forth. And then there's something else in the middle here called a layout snippet. So how many of you know what a layout snippet is? Okay, not too many. So that's good. Let's touch upon that. So the layouts module in Orchard comes with a very nifty feature. I think it's something you have to activate separately, layout snippets, right, Sipke? Where you can essentially just place a view in your module or theme called something snippet.cshtml. And then that view will be discovered by the layout module as an element and show up in the toolbox whenever you edit a layout, and you can just drag and drop it onto the layout. And it's a very sort of low ceremony way to get started. And I think layout snippets are, for me so far, they've been a great compromise between all of these different aspects in packaging up components for use in Orchard, because they give you, in my mind, the most flexibility and functionality for the least possible effort. You can customize the toolbox experience, like the icon and stuff. You can use it in a layout because it's just an element. You can use it in a widget because you can use the layout widget on which you can put that element. You can configure it from the admin UI using something called snippet fields that I'm going to show you in a minute. You can access site settings and make that available to the view by just writing a simple shape table provider for that shape. And all that you really have to write to make it happen is just to put a view somewhere in a module or a theme. So, to illustrate this, I want to introduce the Stockinfo component. It's a sample component that I just wrote up for this demo, and it's a very simple thing. It's just it's a client-side component that goes off and calls an API to fetch some data around, a fictitious product, and returns data about how many units of that product in stock that we have on each, store location that we might have in our chain. I'll show you the API real quick. It's just I have it in a separate module here in Visual Studio. It's just basically a very dumb controller that just has one action, get, and you pass in a product ID. Then it waits for a few seconds so we can see what's going on in the browser when this loads asynchronously. And then it just has a switch. So if you pass in product ID A or B, it kind of returns a few different locations with different numbers of units available, just so we can have something to base it on. And I'll just show you in Postman here. Just send a request to the URL for this API with product ID A. And my Orchard site might have, seems something happened. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, that's not good. What happened here? Does not exist. Oh, actually, let me just go and rebuild.
Is that feature enabled?
Yeah, I did enable it.
Have you killed IIS since you did that?
I did. I changed something in it. Okay, there we go. So it just returns some JSON formatted data, as I showed you. And okay, so that's Stockinfo component. Let me show it to you from the perspective of Orchard. So I built, just put a Stockinfo demo page into my site. Here we can see there's two instances of this component. They're configured to display info for product A and product B, respectively. So you could kind of see that it loaded there asynchronously, and I'll show you what's going on behind the scenes in just a second. And in the admin UI, if you look at the Stockinfo demo page, go and edit it. Then there in the layout editor, we can see these two components there. And these are just like these two instances of the same component that I just dragged onto the same layout. Okay. Okay, and then finally let's look at the Visual Studio sort of manifestation of this component, which is under Views, as I mentioned. So there's two files. There's the Stockinfo snippet.cshtml, as I mentioned. We'll look at the code for this in a minute, but so it just renders some things. And then there's another optional file next to it, which is the same file name, Stockinfo snippet.txt. And that's called a snippet manifest file. And that's a way, you don't have to put that there, but if you do, it's a way for you to tell the layout module some additional information about the snippet that it can use to render it in the layout editor in nicer and better ways. So you have things in there like you can give it a display name, you can give it a toolbox icon, and this is you can just go up and choose any icon from the Font Awesome set. So on fontawesome.com you can just go click on any icon, find out the Unicode character for that, and that's just what you can paste in here. You can give it a description, which shows us the tooltip, and you can categorize it into like a group in the toolbox. So if we look over here, we can see that stuff has all been applied here. There's our icon, so a little truck or lorry, and it's categorized under shop, and the description, when we hover over it, comes up. Okay, so that's what you can get if you put a snippet manifest next to the snippet itself. All right, I want to show you some specifics about the Stockinfo component now. Specifically, stuff to allow us to make things from Orchard available inside our component, which I've done here when I illustrate a few different key topics of this. So you can use something called snippet fields to make a snippet configurable from the admin UI. And the way that you do that is by placing them into the snippet manifest. So you can see I placed two of them in here, one called product ID of type text, one named body of type HTML. And then if you do that, then the layout editor will show an additional edit button here on your snippet element. And if you click that, then it'll render some UI that lets you configure this snippet from the back end, this instance of this snippet. So for the first one, I've just configured it with product ID A. I've given it just some arbitrary HTML content here, and I've done the same thing for the other one with just the product ID B. And that's really that's what makes snippet elements such a good compromise between the most simplistic and the most complex way to package a component up, because you get this sort of level of configurability without having to go and write any code for it. And then the other thing is, out of the box in the layouts module, and you can harass Sipke about this, but it only really supports one type of snippet fields, and that's the text field. But you saw me also using an HTML field. So the reason I could do that is because the snippet field mechanism is extensible, and you can just go and add your own snippet fields to the mix. So I've added one of type HTML. And the only thing that I've had to add to do that is under editor templates, there's just an elements.snippet.field.html, a shape template. And this last part of that shape name, HTML, is just corresponds to whatever you put in the snippet manifest as your field type. And what this one does, it's it's the shape that determines how you would go and edit this field type in the admin UI. So it's this shape template that is responsible for giving us this nice, rich, tiny MC editor for the field here. So instead, if I didn't have that view in place, this too would just look like this one. It would just be a text box, because that's the default. So this is good for, you know, when you want to integrate any type of Orchard content. Really, you want to have site editors be able to intermingle, you know, CMS type content into your component as they place it somewhere on their site. And the final thing I want to illustrate is, so there's really two types of configuration when you think about it when it comes to a component on the site. So there's the things that are kind of unique per instance of the component. So the first two things we showed were a good example. The product ID, you would want that to configure that for every instance of the component. And there was the body. But then there are things like that are more of a global nature, and you don't want to have your users but necessarily go and have to configure it on every single instance of the component. And a good example of that would be the URL to the API that the component is calling out to. So what I've done for that is to just create a simple site settings part. So there's just a simple part for that, which is an API URL property, like just looks like any other content part. There's a handler to activate it and kind of make it available in the menu system in the admin UI. And then there is a view to just render the editor for it. So if I go into the Orchard site again, we can see that we have this API section in the settings here. And there I can just enter in the API URL, and then it's stored in the site setting. So how do I make that available in my snippet element? Well, it's really easy. You can just use a shape table provider for that. So I've added one to the root of this module. It's just a very simple class, implements the iShapeTable provider interface. And what it does in this case is just whenever the Stockinfo snippet shape is being displayed, we are just taking the API site settings part off of the current site, and then just taking the API URL property off of that. Attaching that onto the shape is just the API URL property, and then you can just go and use it in your shape template. So just to return to the snippet itself, which is in here, you can see that we use all of these things just as properties on the model in the shape template. So there's the product ID that we declared as a snippet field. There's the model body, and then up here, embedded in a piece of JavaScript, is the model.api URL. And so these are three ways that we can integrate Orchard-side stuff into a client-side component. All right, so we haven't really looked at what the component does on the client side yet. So let's go and look at that for a bit. So Steve talked earlier about using the built-in gulp pipeline in Orchard. So I'm not going to go into what that thing does or how it works. But you have a choice there of whether you want to use that built-in gulp pipeline as it is. If all you need to do to process your client-side assets is what that gulp pipeline already supports, then by all means that's the best choice. But if you want to do some more exciting stuff, which we're going to want to do, then actually you can also add your own gulp tasks to that existing gulp file. And there's two ways to do that. You can either go and just modify the package.json and gulpfile.js that are in Orchard in the solution root. You would only really ever want to do that because you're changing kind of files that are part of Orchard's code base. So you'd want to do that if you use a version control system where you can leverage let the version control system keep track of the things that you've changed and the changes that might be coming in from Orchard core later on as you kind of pull in later versions. So that would be typically if you use Git, then that's really easy. If you use Team Foundation version control or something else, then the way to do this would be to have the unmodified orchard source in one branch and your customizations in another, and then TFS can just figure out what to do. But there's also another way, which is to add a local gulp scope to just your module, on your module level. So you can add a separate package.json and gulp file on the module level. And the disadvantage to that is that there's a node modules folder created in the root of your module. And you're going to have to just go and delete that whenever you publish. Otherwise it'll become no worries. Otherwise it'll become part of the package, and it contains a lot of stuff that you don't want at runtime. My sort of preferred approach is the top one here, because I always use Git for anything orchard related, so that's what we're probably going to end up doing. And then there's another thing I want to touch upon, which is you have a choice on whether to keep your output assets in source control or not. And it's something I get asked quite a lot, so I wanted to just touch upon this. So one choice is when things get processed through the gulp pipeline, it always outputs something, some JavaScript and some CSS that is sort of the transpiled, bundled output of whatever you're writing for the client-side stuff. And you can choose to include all that stuff in your project file and add it to source control. And the advantage there is that it's very easy for new devs to get started on your code, because they don't even have to install Node, install all the packages, get the pipeline up and running in order to just run the code. It all kind of just works out of the box as they clone your repo. And obviously you also don't need to configure your build and deployment pipeline if you have one in place to worry about Node or gulp or anything like that, because the assets are just there. But there's another choice too, which is to leave the output assets out of the project file and just sort of pretend like they don't exist for development intents and purposes, and use git ignore to just also leave them out of source control. And this is kind of my preferred approach, because I'm so tuned into the whole Node and gulp thing anyway that I always have it installed. And there are some advantages to this approach as well, which is that devs don't have to worry about committing these output files. There's no risk of them being stale or inconsistent with the source, because some developer committed one and not the other. And when you do multiple branches and kind of merge between them, then these output files can yield merge conflicts. And those are really, they're useless, because once you've merged the source files, you can just transpile them again, and then the output will be consistent. So it's really just unnecessary noise. And very minor point, but it does have a smaller version control footprint as well if you don't commit these files. So I tend to favor this approach, but they each have their pros and cons. Okay, so let's go look at the Stockinfo component from kind of this perspective. So as we can see at the top of the Stockinfo snippet Razor file here, we're requiring a script at head. So that is a resource, in the Orchard Resource Manager sense of the word. So where does that resource come from? Well, obviously it needs to be declared in a resource manifest, and that's happening here. Don't worry about the wizard part for now, we'll get to that. It's a different component. So there's our resource declared. It has the minified and non-minified versions of the stockinfo.js. So where do those two come from? As we can see, well, they would be in the scripts folder, but there is no scripts folder in our module here. Well, there actually is, but because I went with that second approach of not keeping it in source control, it's just hidden from me. So, but if I do this to show all files, I can see that here in the scripts, we have the stockinfo and the stockinfo.min.js, and we won't, we look at them, we won't understand anything of what they do, because they're kind of gibberish. So they're there, they get declared into a resource, they get loaded into the shape template. So where do those two come from? Well, I have a bunch of files under assets stockinfo here, and that's how I sort of like to organize everything when building client-side components, is to keep every single client-side assets that is related to this component in the same folder and kind of named consistently like this. So what do we have in here? We have a TypeScript file, which is sort of the main entry point of the component. we have a handlebars file. How many here are familiar with handlebars? Yeah, good, okay. So there's a way to, it's very nifty, there's a way to pre-compile handlebars templates into just plain JavaScript modules that you can execute in the browser or anywhere at runtime. So that's what's going to happen to this handlebars file as part of our build process. It is going to get compiled into just plain JavaScript. And then there's just a definitions file here to kind of teach TypeScript about what that JavaScript module is going to look like once it's been compiled, because before that, TypeScript can't really understand what it is. And then there's a Sass file that applies some styling to the component. And I've kind of split that up here into a section that would typically be provided by the component itself, and then a section that should really come from the theme. And if we have time to get to some practices, I'll explain why this distinction is important. Okay, so we have these 4 files, and somehow they all end up in this JavaScript file in the scripts folder. So how does that happen? So for that, let's go out and look at the solution level at the package.json. So this is the one provided with Orchard out of box, and here on line 30, I've just added some extra packages to it. All the stuff that we need for our custom build pipeline for our client-side assets that are not provided in the Orchard one out of box. So there's a number of packages. Handlebars there being the most notable of them. That's the one we're going to use to pre-compile our template. And then let's go look at the gulp file. So all this stuff is just the normal gulp file that Steve showed you earlier. And then here it ends here on line 256, and then I've added a bit of code here, which is just I've added an additional gulp task to the same file. And we can see that one show up down here in Task Runner Explorer. So we've got the build, rebuild, and watch ones that Steve showed you. And then we've got my 2 custom ones here, demomodule.stockinfo, demomodule.wizard. I don't know if you can see, but they're there. Okay, so those are in Task Runner Explorer. We can just go and run it like this, double click, builds all of our Stockinfo assets into the Stockinfo JavaScript file. Shouldn't take more than just a few seconds. They've already been pre-built, so I didn't really have to do this, but just wanted to show that it does work. There we go, took 3 seconds. Felt longer to me, but okay. So let's go look at what this gulp task does. So it uses something called Browserify. How many here are familiar with Browserify? Yeah, okay, good, 6 or 7. So Browserify is a module bundler. There's a few of those around. Steve mentioned Webpack. There's also one called Lasso. There's Rollup. There's a bunch of them. Webpack, I would say, is probably the most feature-rich and configurable one in terms of flexibility and the sorts of stuff you can do. But Browserify is really easy to get started with, especially if you're using Gulp, because it's really sort of intuitive to get started with it. And what it does is, given sort of an entry point module, it can go and figure out what sorts of things does that module require, and for everything that requires, what things do those things require. And it can sort of build up a hierarchical graph of everything that would be required at runtime for this entry point module to execute. And it can bundle all of that stuff together up into one file so that we can just include that at runtime and everything will just work. And so then you might be wondering, what is a module in this context? Well, a module in terms of Browserify is really just anything that you can compile to a JavaScript module. So it could be a JavaScript file, a TypeScript file, a Sass file, which could actually be compiled into just JavaScript that injects that Sass into the style, into a style element in the head of the page, or handlebars, for that matter. So what we've done here is to invoke Browserify, give it the entry point of the main TypeScript file of our module, and then teach it to transform handlebars, teach it to transform SCSS by using these plugins, and then teach it to understand TypeScript. So that's why we can do this. In our module, that's why we can start with just stockinfo.ts. That one can import using just standard ES6 module import syntax. Import the handlebars file, import the Sass file, and then on the fly, as Browserify kind of goes and follow these references, they'll just get intrinsically compiled by those plugins that we add to the Browserify pipeline. And then it just bundles all of that stuff together, puts it in a stockinfo.js file, puts that in the scripts folder of our module, minifies it, suffixes with min, puts that file in the scripts folder. So that's how it works. And the neat thing about this is we don't have to keep track of what depends on what outside of the modules themselves, because they sort of declare their own dependencies and import whatever they need. And Browserify is smart enough to not, include the same thing twice and kind of keep everything in perfect order and everything, so that the bundle that gets output actually works. All right, good. So we've seen how to do that. Let's then switch gears a little bit and talk about Angular for a second. So you can use a framework such as Angular, obviously, for a client-side component in Orchard, but there's a few tricks I want to show you on how to make it work well. We might just skip over this part of when Angular 2 is a good choice in the interest of time, and just introduce to you the wizard component. So let's look at what that looks like. So I have a wizard demo page, and it's basically just, it does nothing. It's just a component with 2 pages inside of it, where you can just sort of navigate from one to the other and back. So just to simulate a simple wizard scenario. It's written in Angular 2, and from the admin side of things, if we go to content, there's a separate page for it. And there's the wizard component. I didn't add a snippet manifest, so it's not customized the display of it or anything. It's just sort of there. And from the Visual Studio perspective, what we have is just a shape template called wizard snippet. That's the HTML. All it does is require a script and then provides an element where this Angular app can be bootstrapped into. Okay. So just a few notes on how I like to structure things for an Angular component in an Orchard context to make it easy to manage. I typically go and add Angular as NPM packages so that my TypeScript compiler can go reference them from there, and the bundler can find them from there as well. So just to show that, if I go back to package.json on the solution level, I've added a few more things down here, which is all of the different NPM packages that make up Angular 2, basically. So they'll get downloaded and put in the node modules folder of my solution root. And then, interestingly, if I open up the wizard TypeScript file, you can see that you can just import them by name from TypeScript. And I don't know if that's visible, but you can see it kind of resolved the path of it to the root of the solution structure, even though this file is in my module itself. So how does that work? So it turns out TypeScript can actually be configured to use the Node.js module resolution semantics, which is to first look in the local Node.js folder, and if you don't find the module there, go up one step in the directory structure, see if you can find the Node modules folder there. If it's not there, then just keep going until you either hit the root of the disk or you find the module somewhere. So that's why this can sort of work. I can just refer to the modules by name in my local Orchard module, and it'll just find them at some point in the solution root, which is really convenient, I think. The one thing you have to do to get TypeScript to do that is specify an additional option in to the TypeScript compiler to force it into the Node module resolution mode. Okay, so that's what I like to do. Then I like to basically have package everything into one ng module for each sort of cohesive unit of functionality of my application. In this case, for the wizard component, there's really only one, so I'm declaring one ng module. I like to keep one separate folder in assets for each such ng module containing everything as I showed you. And then bundle all of that into one single output file in scripts, and then declare that into a resource with a resource manifest. And that's exactly what I've done in this case. Okay, so let's just see quickly what this wizard component is. So it contains of two subcomponents, one for each step of the wizard. And those components are really very dumb. They just look for a step 1 element and renders like a first step markup from a template, and a step 2, just identical. And then there's a SAS file for styling it so we can see what's going on. And then there's the main entry point TypeScript file that includes all the Angular stuff, includes the other two modules, and just packages it up and shows it using Angular routing so that it behaves in the orchard site like this. And so let's talk about Angular routing for a second, and client-side routing in general. What is that really all about? So the idea there is that if you have a page in your orchard site, let's say that it's this one, just called /some_page, and it contains an instance of your Angular component, the wizard component in this case. A user hits that page gets loaded in the browser, the component bootstraps, but the component itself has two subcomponents that are routable. So when the user clicks the next button of the wizard, or just clicks the step 2 tab, then a navigation occurs but just locally in the browser. So the route for the step 2 component gets appended to the address in the address bar of the browser, but it never does a post back to the server, so the server knows nothing about it. And that's really what client-side routing is about. It's about having a navigation history that is just local to the client. And you can see that it's sort of, I start by just visiting the home page here, and then I go to the wizard demo page, I go to step 2, and then I can use the back button to go back to step 1. Never does a server request. I use the back button again, go back to the home page, and I can sort of navigate back and forth like this. And it sort of intermingles the server-side page history with the client-side page history in the same stack, so everything becomes very natural and fluid for the user. So you would want to use this when you're writing a component that has subsections, otherwise there's really no point. You want the user to see those subsections reflected in the browser's address bar, and you want the user to be able to navigate back and forth using the browser back and forward button. And you want to enable deep linking into those, so you want the user to be able to sort of bookmark any given client-side route and just navigate straight to it. And these things really, what they come down to is if you're building more of a SPA-like component that is intended to be the only or primary component of a page, as opposed to the Stockinfo component that we saw earlier that is really intended to exist in multiple instances, maybe as part of a projection or something. And if you're doing that, then you're going to need to figure out how to combine Orchard server-side routing and alias system with the Angular client-side routing. And out of box, this doesn't work. So I'm going to show you how to make it work. So we already saw this stuff working, but out of box by default, if the user's navigated to client-side to step 2 here, then step back just one bit. Angular. In order for Angular routing to work, it needs a base URL in the markup of the site. So if I go here, open up Developer Tools, we can see that in the head, of our page, we've got this base element here. And Angular needs this to kind of remember where this page was loaded from. And Orchard out of box, of course, doesn't output this element at all. So for that, you can use a component called the base URL filter. And we have this as part of our free open source ideliverable.bits module. It's on GitHub. You can just go and take this component from there. But for demonstration, I added it to this module here under the routing folder. I'm not going to go through what it does right now because I don't think we'll have time. Second problem is, by default, if you try to do this in an Orchard site, and then when the user's navigated to another route on the client, if you try and reload the page at this point, or if you bookmark this address and try to come back to it later, what's going to happen? You're going to get to Orchard, and it's going to give you a 404. Because it doesn't know about any page that has the alias /some page /step2. It only knows about this one. So how can we fix that? Well, we need to extend Orchard routing to be able to match on partial routes. But what I mean by that is, if, let's see if I can zoom a bit here. Oh, too much. Let's say these two pages exist in our Orchard site, and then there are some client-side routes that get appended to the address bar in addition to that. So these two URLs, as a whole, they don't exist. What we need Orchard to do is to be able to take any URL and just kind of find the most specific existing alias of any content item on the site and just route to that, even though it's not an exact match. And to do that, we can use two components called the alias wildcard route and partial alias helper, also available as that free open source module. And I've added those in here too. There's a class with a bunch of logic just to help with the partial alias and URL matching stuff. There's a special type of alias route that subclasses the built-in one that just uses that helper to kind of get this going. And then, of course, you have to have a routes class that goes through all of the areas in the Orchard site and kind of adds this new partial alias route with a low enough priority that any specific routes will take precedence over it. And if you've done that, then stuff like this, like going directly to /step2, will just work. Orchard will find the page, will render it, and the Angular router will notice that this part is appended to the URL, and will initialize it to the second step. Okay, Sebastian, how am I doing on time? Should we just sort of cut it at this point, or? Excuse me?
The lunch is gone.
Okay, let's.
Can you show again the routing piece?
The routing piece,
The code?
the code, yeah, sure. There's a bit of it. So there's the partial alias helper. It has just a bunch of static helper methods. I can't go through all of it, but maybe you can give him the GitHub link, Sipke. You can just sort of check it out there. I really just have one more thing to show. Should I just get to that too, and then we can just break for lunch? Okay, all right, because I think it's a nifty trick. So runtime module loading. What we've seen so far is really a case where we bundle all of the stuff that is required by our client-side components together at build time, and then we just load one script file at runtime. But there's multiple ways of managing these, of loading the dependencies, aside from just bundling everything together at build time. Anything ranging from using only the Orchard Resource Manager to doing bundling with the built-in Gulp pipeline, or to use something like Browserify, like we just did, to all the way to not doing any bundling at all, but to actually use a runtime module loader, such as System.js or Require.js or Almond, to do all of this stuff at runtime. And I think that that's an up-and-coming kind of technique, because the only disadvantage of it is really that we're making more server requests to download like more little individual files. And I think with time, that drawback is going to go away with the advent of HTTP2, where you can do things like multiplex the loading of multiple resources on the same TCP connection, and the server can be smarter about, you ask me for one thing, I know that you're going to ask me for these additional 10 CSS files, so I'll just give them all to you right now, so you don't have to go back to me and fetch them. And when that becomes, pervasive in browsers and frameworks like ASP.NET, ASP.NET Classic actually supports this stuff. You can do this sort of server-side push. ASP.NET does not yet, .NET Core does not yet support this, but it will, of course, eventually. And once that happens, I think, this disadvantage with runtime module loading is really going to go away. So I have a version of all of this where we do this, where we sort of load everything at runtime. So I'll just replace what I have in here with another version of the wizard snippet. Okay, good. And the one thing, I'm not going to go into exactly how you configure System.js, but the one thing I do want to mention is that in the file where you're configuring System.js to kind of tell it where to go and find all of your JavaScript modules at runtime, you have to configure it. And in that file, really, what I've come to realize is you can't just hard code, knowledge about where the script files of your modules are at runtime. So you want any piece of code basically to be able to ask for wizard. Give me the wizard component and load it and let me use it. But how is System.js going to find it at runtime? So we have to configure System.js to tell it where it is. And when doing that, we shouldn't really do this. Just tell it, oh, it's in /orchard local /module /demo module. Because first of all, orchard local as a virtual root directory might not be there in production, or we might use something else, and there might be a tenant prefix in here somewhere. So we really shouldn't assume where our module is in relation to the root of the host name where it's being loaded, which is what System.js needs to know at runtime. The other thing that we don't want to do is to just stick to either the minified or non-minified versions of these files. So we really want System.js at runtime to be able to load minified or non-minified depending on the setting of Orchard, if you're running it in debug or not. But we still want all of this stuff to configure System.js to be in a normal JavaScript file. So one technique that I've come up with to kind of pass this information from Orchard down into a script file, just a normal JavaScript file, is by using something in the resource manager that you can use to just append arbitrary attributes to the script element in the markup. So what this resource manifest does is just first find out where is this module rooted in the site currently, with respect to all the multi-tenancy and where the vroot is and everything, and then find out are we in debug mode or not. And then when we register and define this script, that is the configuration script for System.js, then I just append these things as data attributes on that script tag with these values inside of them. And then inside of the script, you can use a property off of document called current script, and that gives you a reference to the script element from which your script is being executed. And then, of course, we can use jQuery to read the data attributes off of that element, and there we get the scripts path, and then we get the isDebug, and then we can use those inside of our JavaScript code and kind of make sure that at runtime these things resolve to the correct things, so that the module loading that occurs at runtime does so with respect to all of these Orchard-specific sort of aspects of things. All right, I guess then we're out of time. I'm going to put all of this stuff in a series of blog posts, by the way, in the coming weeks. So the stuff that I didn't have time to go through in as much detail as I wanted is going to be on my blog. So you can probably go and dig into it there if you're interested. And with that, I guess thanks very much for listening. And I'm here if there's any questions. Thanks. But, you know, by all means, grab lunch if you want and just come and ask me questions during... Or you want to do one or two now? Okay, yeah, Benedict, go ahead.
Not only I was over time, I also have questions. It was awesome stuff, by the way.
Thanks.
So one of the problems with client-side stuff, especially with now modules, Bower modules, I found in terms of deployment that if you don't do anything, you will just deploy all the stuff that you don't need. And we also used System.js to discover script dependencies. So do you know a good way to basically filter out everything that you don't need and just remove those from the deployment process? What we actually ended up doing is use System.js to discover all the scripts, and it gives you back what the script path. So we just copied all the scripts into a different folder, deleted everything in now modules, and then copied it back. So they are at the same place. Do you know a better way or nicer?
No, I can't say that I do. That sounds like the technique I would go for, basically.
Because I think it's really bad that it's not figured out of the box.
Are you using ES6 or TypeScript? Or are you using plain ES5?
Yes, I think 5. Yeah.
Right. If you're using more of a modular architecture like ES6 or TypeScript, you can use tree shaking to sort of get rid of all the redundant code.
That implies that you're doing bundling at build time, though, right? So you'd use Webpack to do tree shaking, or
or roll up, But then you guarantee that you've not put anything in production that shouldn't be in production.
Yeah, because there's like thousands of files, 200 megabytes that you actually don't need at all, even to run the application locally. It's just there, and it takes a lot of time to deploy it.
Right. Okay. That's all.
Do you see any scenarios for pre-rendering in the server?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I was thinking about that as Steve was doing his talk. I haven't really looked into that stuff yet. I don't know what to... I haven't explored that part of the story, so I don't really have anything to say. I don't know, the stuff that you showed, Steve, with the ASP.NET JavaScript services, does that exist for ASP.NET 4.5, or it's only core?
Just core.
Only core, yeah. Okay, so yeah, that's a shame.
It works on Linux. I tried it.
Cool. Yeah, please.
What is the relationship between snippets and elements?
So snippet is an element. It is just a dynamically discovered element that exists on disk only in the shape of a CSHTML file and an optional manifest.txt file. So it is an element. It's a one-to-one relationship. It's a type of element.
Where did you say you had to activate it? To activate snippets in your...
The feature? Let me show you. It's in the admin UI under modules. You can search for snippets, and the feature is called layout snippets.
Like this would be defined.
Okay. All right, let's break for lunch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.